G'day folks, my name is Rob. Welcome back to another F1 fantasy video. Today we are looking at my very early team selection for the US Grand Prix in a few weeks time. So if you're new around here, be sure to drop a like on the video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Now usually I wouldn't put out these team selection videos so far out from a race weekend when we've got such a big break in between the Grand Prix that's just concluded and the next one coming up in 4 weeks time at the time of recording. But it has been another week where F1 Fantasy has really stuck it to not just me, but also the F1 Fantasy community. And I wanted to get a little bit of a raw reaction from me as opposed to letting it fester for a few weeks, coming back and having it obviously put to the back of my mind and not worried about it anymore, which is usually what I do like to do because I don't want to be that kind of person that goes on the radio and just starts to complain nonstop about, you know, this and that in F1 Fantasy. But I think for the next few minutes, you're probably going to get that just a little bit. So if you don't want to listen to me harping on about X, Y, and Z in F1 Fantasy, feel free to skip ahead to the next chapter in the video. I think before we do jump into a number of the key talking points and points of contention in F1 Fantasy, I do want to talk about Lando Norris's third win in F1. I think he drove exceptionally all weekend. He was in the top two in all three free practice sessions on Friday and Saturday, put it on pole position in qualifying, and held that lead pretty much the whole way through. He did hold it the whole way through the race in Singapore. So I think a very deserving win for him. And honestly, I thought he deserved, of all of the Driver of the Day awards he's won this season, this one I believe he deserved the most. He was so widely 2x'd as well, 2x multiplied, as you can see on the screen here, by so many engaged fantasy managers. So I don't think there was really too much swing in that department, despite the fact that he obviously had not just Driver of the Day, but also the fastest lap snatched away from him by Daniel Ricciardo at the death. Now, quickly on the topic of Daniel Ricciardo, I say quickly, probably a couple of minutes on him. Ricciardo had his highest fantasy score of the season in 2024, 23 points, but 20 of those were obviously Driver of the Day and the fastest lap, and in turn brought with it a $1 million price jump for the Aussie. Now, on the fastest lap, we'll be quick on that one. I do wonder if that attracts the attention of the FIA or teams on the grid around unsportsmanlike conduct, collusion between obviously RB and Red Bull to steal that point away from Max Verstappen, for Max Verstappen away from Lando Norris, which is, I know, 1 point, and I'd be very surprised if the championship goes down to that. But I do wonder if there is a cause for argument from McLaren and other teams on the grid around collusion, you know, lacking of morals or whatever. Maybe I'm reading into it too much. So let me know down in the comments below if you guys have an opinion on that, because I'm very curious to see if it is overhyped or if there is genuine cause for concern around collusion or that, I guess, misconduct that really shouldn't exist between two teams on the grid in F1. Now, more around Driver of the Day, I did say I think Lando very much deserved it after his drive in very difficult conditions at a very challenging track, even for the best drivers. Daniel Ricciardo got that award, and with about 4 laps to go, Ricciardo was at 11%, Charles Leclerc was at 12%, and Lando Norris was at 19%. I don't think David Croft on the Sky Sports broadcast had much to do with it. Maybe he did, but he did say he wouldn't at all be upset if Ricciardo was Driver of the Day if it was to be his last race. I don't know if that necessarily influenced the vote and moved Ricciardo up above 20%, which was what he obviously got to win the Driver of the Day. But I do think regardless of that comment, the award itself in F1 Fantasy specifically is such a farce. It should not exist in the sport, in F1 Fantasy, I should say. There, as I've said before, is no place for a Man of the Match award in fantasy sports. If they do exist, they should have little to no bearing on the scoring. 10 points in F1 Fantasy is what a good midfield driver would score. And for someone like Ricciardo, to be fair, it could be his swan song, and we'll talk about that as well. But the Driver of the Day award specifically, as a point scoring category in F1 Fantasy needs to be removed entirely. You can lump fastest lap, you can lump disqualifications and DNFs in there as well as point scoring categories that either need to be adjusted or removed entirely from the game in 2025, or it is going to discourage new and or returning F1 fantasy managers heading into next year, just because of how big these swings in ranks and scores per week can be. So I think it needs to be adjusted for F1. It needs to be removed from F1 fantasy. And I do think, particularly, as I said, for the amount of weight that's given to something that has zero bearing on fantasy strategy to an extent. Of course, I think Norris at many points this season was obviously the best choice because of that. But regardless, I do think there's too much stock in an award that really cannot be anticipated at all over the course of the weekend. Now, quickly on Daniel Ricciardo, yes, he did obviously get that award because of, I think, the public vote nostalgia and their sentimental feelings towards a driver that's given so much to the sport. I think for Ricciardo, he did so much at Red Bull. At one point, you could argue he was a top 2 driver on the grid. He's won 8 races in his career, such a storied career, and obviously documented that he's probably not made some of the best moves over the last few years in his career. But I think the fact that there was absolutely no comms around that from Red Bull or RB heading into the weekend, during the weekend, and essentially let Sky Sports run with the narrative that he's out of a seat, albeit it probably seems likely now, but nothing's confirmed. You could just tell that his mood from Thursday through to Sunday deteriorated like nothing else. Deteriorated worse than Haas tires in 2023. And I do think this isn't a new thing for Red Bull. The same problem happened with Sergio Perez during or in the lead up to the mid-season summer break. And there was nothing again from Red Bull to address these rumors, get on the front foot with it. Sure, there perhaps is a point in time where a decision is made, but it got so wildly out of hand then, and it got so wildly out of hand in Singapore for Ricciardo, that this isn't something that I think is an environment that's conducive to drivers feeling like they can do their best and be at their best, even off track. And you could see the emotion in Ricciardo in his post-race interviews, all of the reports around him, saying goodbye to friends in the paddock because it probably is going to be his last race in RB. It's just disappointing from Red Bull, to be honest. And it's really sad to see a driver like Ricciardo, should he go out this way, obviously end his career on this note. So very sad, as an Aussie as well. He's done so much for the sport in Australia, and I do think he deserves better, to put it bluntly. Back to my team quickly in, I guess, other news around F1 Fantasy Hub. The decision to go from Zhou to Bottas couldn't have gone any worse if I tried. There were plans for me to forward plan for the sprint race to bring in Piastri, bring in Mercedes, and bring in Zhou, and remove Ferrari, Albon, and Sainz. That backfired completely. I not only got the Albon the DNF, Ferrari scored exactly the same as Mercedes, but I think the biggest difference was that Zhou went up 0.5 million again. I don't think that guy had to back-to-back $0.5 million increases in his bag in that absolute tractor that Sauber have got on track at the moment. But it's just another theme of my season where every decision and every plan and strategy I make with a degree of forward planning and a well thought out approach just seems to go tits up. And it's frustrating because these DNFs and these price swings have pretty much put a dagger in my team for this year. So it is frustrating to say the least. 3X as a result, which the plan was obviously to bring in Oscar Piastri to pair with Lando Norris, is essentially off the table. So it is quite frustrating and a kick in the guts because it's just, you put so much thought process and decisions and, information into obviously what goes into your team. And, a DNF's one thing, but then to have the 3X pretty much ripped up in front of me and push back to it at Brazil at the very earliest is a bit frustrating. So, there is, I think, a degree of variance that plays into how our teams and our cost cap grows, but I'm at that point of the season now where I'm so far on the back foot with price drops from Sainz in Baku, from Russell in Spa, and then other results that haven't gone my way, that I'm now at a point where I'm essentially praying week in, week out for drivers that I don't own to DNF. And that's just so counterproductive to this game, where you obviously want to or should be hoping for drivers that you own to do well. You shouldn't be, compared to the drivers you do own and want to do well, hoping for the drivers you don't own to do worse. So it is really frustrating. And, I think we've probably all had that thought at one point or another in fantasy games where, you don't want other players or other drivers or whatever it might be to do as well as the ones you do own. But now I'm praying for DNFs to not just affect the scores for teams around me, but also affect the price drops. Like I would need, for example, a $0.7 million price decrease from Oscar Piastri to suddenly bring him back into contention and also own McLaren and Mercedes/Ferrari. So it's gone probably not any worse than I could have even anticipated at this point. But again, try and stay positive and finish the season on a high. But, it's also past the point of being overly hilarious. You can obviously laugh at these bad results, but it is frustrating. I'll be completely honest. For team selection considerations for Circuit of the Americas, as I've said, 3x chip for me is more or less off the table with these price swings, which makes it very difficult for me. So I do think Circuit of the Americas for the 3 remaining sprint races is probably the best. And the reason I say that is for teams with higher budgets that can get into, say, triple McLaren right now is primarily because they are the most known commodity on the grid right now. I think Oscar and Lando have demonstrated that they are a force to be reckoned with in F1 Fantasy. I'll just bring up their points on F1 Fantasy tools. Norris, top scorer in Singapore. Oscar Piastri, third top scorer. Piastri and Norris, top 2 scorers in Baku. Norris and Piastri, both in the top 3 for fantasy in Monza. Piastri obviously a bit further down, but Norris, again, the top scorer in the Netherlands. Oscar Piastri in the top 3 in Belgium, Oscar and Lando in the top 3 in Hungary. You can go as far back, obviously, until Singapore, but the fact that both of these drivers are in the top 3 most race weeks is exactly what you want on a 3X. You want reliable drivers, and I look at Oscar. He's finished every single lap in every Grand Prix this season. And Lando Norris, who is, in my opinion, for the rest of the season, not just the best driver on the grid, but also the best 2X option in the best car. So I think you kind of put all of these together. It's the perfect storm at a track where there isn't really all that much of a threat, in my opinion, from other drivers around them. I think before we get on to Red Bull and their impending changes to the car, the fact that it's also going to be a dry race, or you'd think it would be a dry race at COTA just because it never really rains there at this time of year in Austin. So I think that's also just one less variable you don't need to think about. The one drawback for using it in Austin is that Red Bull are bringing changes to the car at this race. Max has won the last 3 years in a row at this track. He's been on the podium the last 5. And if the upgrades or the changes to a car that seems to have been, on the slide since Spain of 2023 suddenly jumps back to the front of the field, it makes that 3X chip much more difficult to think about absolutely using. I think if you are comfortable with going for 2 drivers in the top 3 most race weeks, and you're not worried about Max Verstappen taking points off Lando and Oscar as fantasy assets, then I think that's perfectly okay. If you've got budget to bring in Max and Red Bull look great, then I think that's an even bigger differential that you'd want if you could afford it. But I do think Red Bull should be a cause for concern if these upgrades look as expected in practice and sprint qualifying at Austin. In terms of Brazil and Qatar, Brazil, I think, favorable for lower budget teams. You get a couple more weeks between Circuit of the Americas, Mexico, and then Interlagos to build a bit more budget to position your team for using the 3X. It was a high overtake track 2 years ago, 4th highest with around 75 or so, then slightly lower in the pecking order last season. And it is, I think, probably going to end up somewhere in between both of 22 and 23, maybe like 7th to 10th 10th in number of overtakes. So I think that's good in a sense that if one of your or both of your drivers on your 3X chip qualifies out of position, there is some room to maneuver overtakes during during the race. So I think that's a good sign for that. But it is a track contrary to the US and Qatar, a track that does get rain, has a history of raining over Grand Prix weekends. And you throw in the fact that it was also a track that had the second highest rate of drivers that were not classified last season, Qatar the highest, as I think some cause for concern. But I do suspect there is no coincidence that the US was, if you throw in the disqualifications for Charles Leclerc and Lewis Hamilton, who, surprise, surprise, I also had on the limitless chip last season, occur. I think sprint races are naturally going to attract some attrition, and I think that's also why no negative is going to be very valuable on one of these later sprint races. So something to think about, but I think better for these last two sprints for those lower budget teams, and that's where I think Qatar may well come in. At that point in the season, is the World Drivers' Championship sewn up by Max Verstappen? I don't, even though Lando is pushing, don't think he's going to relinquish P1 in the championship with only so few races left. So I think by that point, maybe the standings in the World Drivers and Constructors is already sewn up, and there's very little room to move in the top teams in the midfield. So there's less at stake, less to race for. Maybe that does mean the order on track is to be expected. Drivers won't be taking as many late lunges or as many risks on track to get into position, and that as a result probably means the running order is going to be more or less similar to what you might see in practice and sprint qualifying. But I think the largest and most obvious disadvantage for using the 3X there is that there are no backup sprints after this. So if you're going into this deadline with two drivers in mind to using the chip on, and for whatever reason one or both of them look really out of sorts for that weekend, you have no flexibility, or very limited flexibility, I might say, to position your team to bring in other drivers to obviously counteract that unforeseen circumstance. So I think that's another reason why carrying 3 transfers into these remaining sprint race weekends is good. It gives you a bit more flexibility if a plan that you'd anticipated suddenly goes belly up and doesn't obviously go the way you're hoping, and you have to make last minute changes as a result. I think we've already talked about the RB20 and those changes that are expected. So maybe someone like Max Verstappen on sprint weekends becomes a very powerful option. The constructor hasn't really had its measure in the pit stop points lately, so I don't really see that becoming a huge asset to think about into the back end of the season, unless Max and Checo are P1, P2 most races. And then Checo I like as a differential asset at 23 odd million, but I'm not so sure I'm jumping at him when the likes of the Ferraris and the McLarens, a couple million more, are doing their job and more. So something to keep in mind, but I do think 3X forward planning is certainly how we need to think about it heading into this stanza of sprint races to close the year out. Quickly on my team selection, talked about it a little bit, so none of this will come as a surprise to you, but the plan heading in to the Singapore deadline, up until seeing Ferrari and the fact that I probably could squeeze a little bit more value out of someone like Alex Albon, would have been to have done Oscar Piastri in and the Mercedes constructor in with Zhou. So I would have run 2 Sauber drivers, triple McLaren, and then had enough for the Mercedes constructor. But Zhou going up 0.5, Albon going down 0.2, that $0.7 million swing means I can't really afford Mercedes anymore. So the other alternative would have been to have gone something like this. But at this point, if you're getting in 2 McLaren drivers on your 3X and your 2X, you're essentially hoping they do well. So it seems a bit counterintuitive to go without the constructor. So that's kind of the approach here. As I said, I'm really needing bad luck for drivers I don't own and good luck from drivers I do own, like Sainz, to get a price boost to obviously squeeze back into this McLaren. Otherwise I might end up having to use it on Norris and Sainz, which would be an absolute disaster on the 3X. But, as I've said, the bad luck's really bitten me bad. So that's, one strategy that I just cannot afford right now. I've been carrying transfers for the last 2 weeks because I don't have the budget to make moves elsewhere, unless, of course, I went off Lando Norris. I could bring in Charles I could maybe bring in Oscar Piastri. That would give me just enough to get in to Zhou. But at this point, these guys are A-tier assets, so you're not really getting the growth we saw from them in Monza and in Baku. $0.1 million increases for both of them in Singapore. So not quite what I expected at the moment, but, I'm managing to get a little bit of value out of Colapinto. So if he keeps flying and Sauber keeps falling, maybe by Brazil, maybe by Qatar, I can somehow squeeze into a triple McLaren. But right now, really stumped with what to do, even with the 3 cheapest backmarkers in the game. So very difficult, very frustrating for my team heading into Circuit of the Americas. 0 chance at this point I'll be using the 3X chip. Very high chance I won't even be using my 3 transfers. And as a result of that, probably means my 3X chip is probably sidelined for one of the last 2. But if you guys are planning to use your 3X in Circuit of the Americas, let me know who you're planning to use it on. I think Norris and Piastri are popular for obvious reasons. But if there are other drivers you are considering, like Max Verstappen, like Charles Leclerc, for example, let me know down in the comments below, because I would be eager to get a differing point of view to what seems to be an otherwise very popular strategy heading into Austin. But I'm going to leave it there for now, guys. I know there'll be a little bit of a gap between now and my next video, my race week preview and final thoughts ahead of the Circuit of the Americas deadline. But I did want to get this out early to give you a bit of a raw, real-time reaction to the results in Singapore and obviously what that means for my team heading into the next few races. So thank you very much for watching, guys. Enjoy the break, and I'll see you again very soon.